why don't we start a little bit with, because I think I've got a pretty good timeline of your 2 tours in Vietnam and your service after that, but I don't know much about you, like, where'd you grow up?
Well, actually, not too far from where you're sitting. I was born in Everett, Washington,
Mm,
and at an early age, about 6 or 7, we moved to Mount Vernon, just up the road from there, and pretty much stayed there right through high school, and then came back to Seattle to go to the University of Washington. While I was there, I was an ROTC guy because I figured out I could make, I think it was $30 a month extra by doing that. So when I completed college, I owed the Army 2 years of absolute duty on
what
active duty.
what year was that?
That was 62. So they sent me off to Germany, and I was assigned, I was in the Corps of Engineers. So I was assigned in Mannheim to a float bridge company, the 552nd Engineer Company, and served 2 years there, eventually became the company commander. And while I was there, on 1/4 of July, uh, I got myself okayed to take the day off and went to a little German guest house on the river by Heidelberg, just up the river. And later that evening, bumped into a gal on a dance floor in the basement of the guest house who turned out to be from Denmark in a summer language course in the University of Heidelberg. And to make a long story shorter, we started corresponding. And in October of that 63 now, we ended up getting married in Copenhagen, just north of the city, in Lena's, that's her name, Lena's hometown, little stone church that maybe 5 or 6 generations of her family had been married there. It was a storybook wedding. We had our reception in the Danish king's hunting castle, pulled there in a carriage with white horses and a little band in the balcony, and it was really quite an affair. So that's a little bit of background history for you.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. I'd forgotten how much, geography you and I have in common. I not only live just outside of Seattle, um, but, I was born in Mannheim. My mother is from Mannheim. Her family is from Mannheim. I've spent a lot of time there and in Heidelberg as well. When you were I'm trying to figure out how you went from signal corps to helicopter pilot.
Well, it was not Signal Corps, it was Corps of Engineers.
Oh, sorry, right, engineers, yep.
But while I was in the river crossing company, we had a flight detachment in my engineer group. They had the little Bell bubble helicopters, and I would take those to get an aerial view of possible river crossing sites on the Rhine. There was only certain places we could do that, but nevertheless, I loved it when I was up in the air with these guys flying around. So I decided, after speaking with the pilots, they told me, well, shucks, if you're going to do your 2 years and go back, Rich, I tell you what, we'll line you up with flight tests and a written test and make sure you don't crash and burn and you have a chance to pass all these tests. I did, and I passed them, and I passed aviation flight physical, and I submitted it to DC to go to flight school. And the Corps of Engineers told me, no, we're in desperate need of more commanders. If you want to stay in the military, come back. And unfortunately, you can't go to flight school. So I went to my old Grizzly group commander, and I was about to check out and go home. He says, Rich, when you get back, go join the Ready Reserves immediately. Find a headquarters that's got a big enough headquarters unit to have a flight detachment and apply to go to flight school that way. So I did that. And when I got back, I joined the 498th Engineer Amphibious Command in Seattle. It's no longer there. But at that time, it was up and running, and they made me the aide to the commanding general. Well, that was kind of handy. The commanding general was one of the executive vice presidents of Boeing Aircraft at the time, named General Max Bitz. And so I told him my story, and one day he came to weekend drill and he said, Rich, he says, I've got to go back to DC to a meeting. And I know you want to go to flight school, so why don't you get your paperwork ready and I'll take it with me. Meet me at SeaTac by 7:30 tomorrow morning. So I went home and I typed all this stuff up again in triplicate and managed to get to SeaTac the following morning. And he was there, he took it, and lo and behold, 6 weeks later, I was on orders to active duty flight school in Mineral Wells, Texas. That's how we got my start in aviation, and specifically in helicopters first, because later on I got qualified in fixed wing as well.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about that, experience in Mineral Springs? Any, uh, any vivid memories from that period?
Not really. It was, we had the older helicopters there still. We had Hillers, and it was a good school. It was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. I think it was leased property from the Johnson family. We had foreign students going with us to class too. You pretty well knew the first week if you were going to make it or not, because if you couldn't hover a helicopter and keep it still in one place, by then you were a washout. So they had a lot of people pump them through the classes then, because helicopter pilots were needed already in Vietnam. And so they were really pumping things up. So we learned the basic flight things and soloed for the very first time. My solo flight was from Mineral Wells to Abilene, Texas and back, and all alone at about 8,000 feet. It was fun. So we learned a lot of things there. And then from there, that was only the first part of flight school. We went from there to Fort Rucker, Alabama, and transitioned into bigger aircraft, Hueys. And we learned a whole bunch more about instruments and flying and crews, and even gunnery at that time, before we graduated and had a little leave time, and then we were on our way to Vietnam.
So what year was that?
That was, well, finished up in Fort Walters in 66. And it was a 30-day respite and leave and get your stuff in order. And then I was off to Vietnam. My wife was spending time between my parents in Mount Vernon and a flight school friend of mine whose wife lived in Texas, and she spent a lot of time with her, and then took a flight around the world, the old Pan Am Flight 1, where as long as you keep going one direction, you can circumnavigate the globe. And she did just that, stopping places all along the way. And we eventually met for my first Vietnam R&R in Hong Kong. So that was interesting.
Hmm. So you arrived in Vietnam in May of 66, is that right?
That's correct. I had May 66 to May 67, then came home and went to some schools and things, and went back from September 68 to September 69.
And what do you remember most vividly about arriving in Vietnam for the first time in May of 66?
Uh, well, we went, not all people went as a unit. We went as individuals. So I was on a charter flight, and the very first thing I remember at landing at Tan Son Nhut, and the doors opened and we went down the stairs, we were hit in the face with uh, the smells and the heat. It was just a real shift in weather, and I can still close my eyes and remember the smells that were involved with that.
Yeah, all the guys I talk to, that's the first thing they talk about when the doors opened, being hit in the
Yeah.
face with the smell and the heat. So what you were with the 335th Assault Helicopter Company at that time, and what rank were you?
I started out as a first lieutenant. Of course, most of the guys that came with me were warrant officer pilots. But because I'd served that tour in Germany, I was already an officer. So that made me an older guy at 26, because most of the warrant officers were anywhere from 19 to 22. And I spent that full year with the 335th. And we were in Third Corps, just not too many clicks north of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, at Bien Hoa, near the Bien Hoa Air Base,
Mhm.
with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which was our parent unit.
Yeah. So I mean, was that an interesting dynamic? I mean, on the one hand, you were a little older and higher in rank, but on the other hand, those guys had been flying in Vietnam for some time. So can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Yeah, let's say you started at ground zero. Uh, the guys that had been there, regardless of rank, if they had advanced to be an aircraft commander, uh, when you were flying the AC, the aircraft commander, who might have been Warrant Officer 1, if he had a major flying with him who wasn't an AC yet, then the major better listen to him and do what he says, because he was the captain of the ship while you were airborne.
Mm. And what kinds of missions or duties primarily were you fulfilling in that first tour?
Well, I pretty much did the gauntlet. I started out driving or flying. We used to say driving, but flying slicks, which were of the primary troop carrying mission. Helicopters gave everything a new dimension. The primary reason for them was moving troops around rapidly. Great flexibility on the battlefield then. And you had small groups to large groups, uh, one helicopter to 20 or more helicopters for bigger lifts. And so you had troop movements in helicopters. We did that. We did reconnaissance of areas for future assaults. And then you had to pick out landing zones, and we would locate areas for fire support bases. We, of course, assisted when necessary for medevac. And the other thing we did a lot of was resupply to troops that were already engaged in the field. We were their lifeline. We provided new ammunition, food, took people out that had to be extracted. We inserted LRPs, long-range reconnaissance patrols. We did all that, and we provided command and control from the skies too. And then I, in my first 2 or 3 months there flying slicks, I got shot at a lot, like everybody did. And I was thinking, man, I'd really like to be able to shoot back. So I auditioned more or less with and put in my feelings to join the gunship platoon. And their call sign were Falcons. So they gave me a couple test runs at it. They took me out with them, and they did aerial close combat support. They provided cover for troop insertions. They did reconnaissance by fire. But more than anything, they gave close air support to the people. After a couple trips with them, they decided that, well, okay, he's a pretty good shot. So I transferred from flying slicks to become a full-time gunship pilot. And I spent the rest of my year with them doing just those kinds of things. Wide range of all kinds of interesting things, from nighttime river patrols to convoy escorting to day and night operations. We got farmed out to other units for special purpose. We'd be on standby at a fire base for overnight. I can remember trying to sleep at a fire base overnight, almost impossible, because we'd sleep in or under the helicopter. And if you were near an 8-inch 155 millimeter artillery battery that was firing harassment and interdictory fire at night, just about the time you got your eyes shot, why the whole helicopter would rock on the skids and wake you back up again with noise from the artillery. But it was a time that it was a good thing we were all young, because you didn't have a lot of time to get scared in the first place. Things were moving too fast. And you needed to be young with a lot of stamina, because sometimes you didn't get much sleep, time to recover, but that was not a problem at that age. And reflexes were real good. And so we just carried on. It was an interesting thing. One thing with the crews, in helicopters, the crews became not intimate, but very trusting with each other. You had to depend on these people. Back when I was resupplying in a slick driver, you try to resupply through holes, little holes in a triple canopy jungle that were just big enough for the helicopter to fit into. And you'd have to go down maybe 50, 60 feet and depend on a door gunner and a crew chief telling you stop, because you have to move over left 20 feet to go down another 40 feet. So you were very independent, or not independent, but dependent on these people telling you and working together as a family, a real crew. So the trust and the bond in helicopter crews was really great.
You know, it makes me wonder how well your training in Mineral Wells prepared you for that. Like, if you could go back and you know, talk to the young Rich Kuhblank who's in flight school with the benefit of hindsight, what would you tell him that would prepare him differently or better for actual combat?
Well, I didn't have to do that. Many of the guys that got reassigned from their first tours in Vietnam went back to those very same training locations and became instructor pilots. They brought all that experience with them, and they would make changes in the flight training syllabus that would end up sharing those things and making it a better deal for each class in succession. So that worked really well.
What about the aircraft? Was it a big adjustment to go from whatever aircraft you were learning on to the ones you were actually flying?
No, not really, because the basic principles of lift, coordination, uh, depending on what instruments you had at the time, all those things you could pick up in a matter of a few hours in different aircraft.
You sent me a couple of documents where you had just sort of recorded some very specific and vivid memories from your time in Vietnam. Um, there was one in particular that I'd like you to tell, if you don't mind, and it's the Chalk 4 going down story.
I recall one day that we were moving troops to a combat insertion with about 10 or 12 helicopters. And I was in a light fire team providing cover for their insertion. and they were in trail formation. And when we inserted troops, they got a number for the troops to understand easily to climb on board. We gave them chalk numbers, and they actually had a chalk number on the side of the aircraft so they'd recognize where they were supposed to go. And it was chalk 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many were in the flight. Well, I'm going along with my little light fire team, one of 4 fire teams escorting this bunch. And on the radio, I heard a sound you don't want to hear. It just came through loud and clear. Chalk 4 is going down. That was a bad thing to hear. And I looked up, and sure enough, Chalk 4, the 4th helicopter, started tumbling out of the sky. Now, we don't know, well, I shouldn't say that. Years later, I found out what happened. But at that time, we didn't know if it was ground fire. We didn't see any ground fire around, but you could never tell because you didn't always see it. But Chalk 4 went down, and I told my wingman to stay with the slicks, and I would go down and follow Chalk 4. I was losing altitude fast to keep up with the helicopter's descent. But Chalk 4 at about, I don't know, 50, 60 feet above the treetops, we had troops jumping out. And I mean, seconds after that, the helicopter crashed, and there was no burn. That was good. And we went down and circled for, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, trying to contact and look for survivors, which was really difficult because they crashed in a real heavy jungle. And finally just couldn't do it. Well, because we'd done that loitering around, we didn't realize that a monsoon rainstorm, common in that area at that time of year, had come up, and monsoons could be deadly. They just came up fast, and that's what happened to us. We were in a temporary field location at the time supporting this. And so I knew we had to get back because we'd spent enough time there now that the fuel was low. So I set a course to go back to our little camp, and it's a good thing I did because no sooner than we were about 5 minutes away from the crash site that the monsoon closed in. And it was so bad, so windy, and so rainy that we literally had a whiteout. And there's no nav aids in that area to speak of that would have helped us out on instruments. So I remembered in flight school, they taught us something that said, you know, once in a while, if everything's not good, it says contact your radio operator at your base camp and on FM, tell him to key his mic about every 20 or 30 seconds. And if you get close enough to him, your ADF needle will home on it. So that's exactly what we did. As we got closer and closer to the camp, why, we were following the needle. After a while, the operator, our little radio operator in the field location says, I can hear you guys, but I can't see you. Well, visibility was only 2 or 3 feet all around the aircraft. He says, but I can hear you now. You're so doggone loud. So I came to a hover, set us down towards the ground, hoping there was no trees between us and the ground. And sure enough, we sat down on the ground. Thank God, 20 seconds later, the aircraft quit. The engine shut down. We were out of fuel. I mean, we were within 2 or 3 minutes of crashing and burning and nobody hearing from us, as well as Chalk 4. Chalk 4, by the way, years later in my second tour, I came across a report that had documented that all 10 people on Chalk 4 were dead, 4 crewmen and 6 grunts, soldiers, GIs. But they had an accident investigation, and it was a trunnion on the rotor system that had failed. And they were able to come up with a fix for that. And they actually did make a modification to other helicopters and save lives in the process. So that's really all there is to that story, but it was amazing that we made it back in one piece ourselves.
Yeah, excuse me, I can't imagine flying blind and just listening for the radio operator keying his mic, and that's how you, I mean, you're flying by sound at that point.
Uh, well, not really totally by sound. By keying his mic, it directed our ADF navigation needle on the dash to head the right direction all the time. It was like following an ADF transmitter.
Okay, forgive me, I don't know what ADF stands for.
Automatic direction finding. It's a system of navigation that is broadcast.
Okay, got it.
And that's fine.
Wow. So you had a second tour,
Yeah,
September 68 to September 69.
right.
Well, what are the key differences that we need to know about what you were doing in that second tour?
It was quite different for me because my year out, I had been sent to the Army Aviation Safety course at University of Southern California and Edwards Air Force Base. So when I returned to the 1st Infantry Division for my second tour, I became the division aviation safety officer. So I was in charge of setting up investigations for all crashes, whether they were hostile or were mechanical or pilot error. Those things would be determined by accident investigations. So I had a master list of all the pilots because they all had duty assignments to become investigating officers. But during that same year, as the guy in the division, I was often the first guy in to a crash site to see if there was any obvious things that could be identified immediately. So I would assign and assist warrant officers and others to become an investigative officer for the long-term investigation of this. The division was fortunate because we had an ASTA platoon of aircraft. ASTA means aerial surveillance and target acquisition. That was a Mohawk turboprop aircraft armed with cameras. Their real duty was recon of the area of operations for the future and taking pictures of this and that and the other thing. But they also came in really handy in investigating crash sites and reasons perhaps why these things happen. So I was really involved in that. I had responsibility to set up instructor pilots for standardization checks of everyone that they had to complete periodically. I would go out and inspect these holes in the canopy where I talked about my first tour, getting down and in and out, to make sure that they could in fact do that in the first place, that the infantry guys hadn't strung common wire around everywhere where the rotors could get wrapped up, and generally tried to get people to comply with standard safety rules that would keep people safe if everything else worked properly. That was interesting. I have memories of so many bad things in that regard, because like I said, I was one of the first guys in on some of these accidents. I remember taking a warrant officer with me once to a crash site where we have to ride on a CH-47 tandem rotor, big helicopter, to take us to the crash site because it was in the trees and no landing place around it close by. So we went out the tailgate of the CH-47 on a 60-foot rope ladder. And we were still about 20 feet up above the ground when an RPG, rocket propelled grenade, hit the CH-47 between the tandem rotors. We jumped and hit the ground from about 20 feet up into this crash site. The CH-47 was in real trouble. It made about 300 yards to the left and crashed. And then we had two crash scenes within close range of each other. We spent maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 days on the ground unsnarling that one. And those are the kinds of things that were, I don't know, repeated more often than not. It was not a good climate in Vietnam for helicopters, but yet they became the lifeline for most of the people there, and were still wonderful. Our hats are off, and especially second tour, I think I became more aware of the work that the medevac guys did. The dust off people, they were truly lifesavers of all kinds of people that helicopters made possible to rescue and save that would have never made it otherwise. And that's been true as modern things got up to the present day, you still have that going for people. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, most of the people I talk to, they describe that sound as the sound of hope, right? The sound of a helicopter is the sound of hope. Um, because it means, it can mean fresh supplies, it can mean evacuation, it can mean, air support, but it almost always means something good.
Yeah, I've talked to a couple of guys, maybe not so many years ago now, but whenever I run across people in Army organizations like the VFW is, every once in a while I run across the people that say, "Oh, you flew helicopters." That old wop, wop, wop sound is golden to me. It saved my butt many times, and they're just really happy about that.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to shift gears here in just a second, but before we do, there's one more story that I'd like you to tell if you don't mind, and that's about it's the story that you sent me about being assigned to support an Australian task force.
Oh, yeah. Um, the Australian task force was hunkered down in an area in Third Corps, just north of Vung Tau. Vung Tau was on the coastline directly east almost of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. And they had troops on the ground, and they had slicks, Hueys, but they didn't have any gunships. So every once in a while, we'd get assigned to provide a couple of light fire teams to the Australian task force and spend a couple of weeks with them in support of their ground troops. I was down in with a light fire team supporting those same troops north of Vung Tau, and we were out just making a recon one day when we got an emergency call from the Aussie LRP. They had a long range patrol too, but they didn't have as many guys in their long range patrol as the Americans did. And this Aussie alert had only 3 guys. But we got this emergency call from them in our area that they had been on the ground and been discovered by the VC. They had got in an armed conflict with them and been able to break contact, and they were running for their lives through the jungle, and they needed to get out to get extracted immediately, or curtains they were going to be no longer. So we responded, and the guy that was their team leader said, "We can hear you." And they set up a balloon through the trees. It was one of their ways of marking things. And we spotted it and went over, and my wingman went into orbit, and I hovered above the balloon, and we lowered a rope, gunner and the crew chief, and we started pulling these guys out one by one. Well, by that time, the VC found us again. We had 2 guys in the helicopter already, unharmed, and we had the rope down to the 3rd guy, and by then the fire got intense and we were starting to take a couple hits ourselves. So despite help from my wingman who was spraying the area to keep guys down, we knew we had to get out. So I pulled pitch and pulled up, and I thought the guy was clear, but he wasn't. And I drug him through the treetops a little ways. And when we got him into the helicopter, eventually, why we found out that he had broken his leg. So we got him back to the base camp for the Aussies, and they had their own medical facility set up there. So we put him down on the pad, and the medics came out and hauled him off, and we shut down the aircraft. And the co-pilot and I were going to go over and check on this guy. And about that time, this little Aussie guy came up and he said, "Look at guys, the commander wants you to debrief him right away." And I said, "Well, we were on our way to check on this guy." He says, "Don't worry about it." He says, you got to go see the commander." So we paid attention to him and went over to this hex tent where the Aussie commander was. And I says, "We just hauled your guy out of the trees and everybody's going to be all right, but we think that this one guy's injured." He says, "Oh," he says, "don't worry about that." And he looked at his watch and he says, "It's tea time." And I said, "Tea time? You know, I'm a coffee drinker." But he says, "Yeah, it's tea time." And
Of course, you're a coffee drinker. You're from Seattle, right?
sure enough, sure enough, this Aussie corporal comes in in a tent with a silver service and actual, nice cups and saucers, and we have tea. And then we get the briefing to the commander, and we were able to say hello to the other guy, and everybody was happy. But they did get out, and we all got home in one piece. Another example of helicopter help.
Yeah, great story. Stop the war. It's time for tea.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I appreciate you indulging me, as we kind of go back through some of the experiences that you had in Vietnam. I kind of like to shift away from that now a little bit. Um, as you were talking about the different kinds of roles that helicopters played in that war, and the Vietnam War is known as the helicopter war. When you think about the role of helicopters in 21st century warfare, what do you think? What do you think is the legacy of Vietnam helicopter pilots and crew members? What does 21st century helicopter warfare owe to the experience and lessons from Vietnam?
Well, that's a tough question. I can only speculate on it because I've only been like you, tuned up to the news of everything that's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the Mid East there. But as technology has developed and helicopters along with it, the most important thing I see on the horizon right now, and that's being more developed all the time, are drones. And I think that's the natural offshoot of technology. And it takes for at least for aerial support, reconnaissance wise, and maybe weapon wise, that's a good way to go. But there will always be room for helicopters in the people category. When you've got boots on the ground, they need the support to still move around and have the equipment move around and their supplies move around. So I still see that as a real part of the action, even though drones and maybe something we don't even know about yet will come along and pick up a piece here or there and take some of the heat off.
So you spent a total of 24 years on active duty, and in 1986 you retired at the rank of colonel. Is that right?
Yeah, I had made it up to colonel.
And then you went to work for the State Department and ended up going back to Vietnam in the 90s. Can you talk about the
Yeah,
circumstances surrounding those trips and what you remember from them?
yeah. The interesting thing about that was that I didn't expect that to happen, but uh, I was working for the Diplomatic Security Corps, and the overseas buildings portion of the State Department as a security engineer. So based on my military background, that helped me a lot with that job because we would assess uh, threat levels around embassies and consulates, locations for new ones, and whether or not they were in a protected area naturally or would have to have several things done to make that happen. So lo and behold, one of the first places they sent me back to was, like you just said, Vietnam. So I went back. Uh, First place I went. Upon return, I was with an early bunch of about 4 or 5 guys who had representation of State Department and other, let's say, government agencies. And we went into Hanoi. I had never expected to be in Hanoi. Our old embassy had been taken over and babysat by the Bulgarians. We went in and were picked up and bunked out with the American MIA detachment, missing in action guys, who were working out of a place called Plantation. And as I understand it, Plantation had been an earlier location of an American prisoner of war camp run by the North Vietnamese. They had their own couple of helicopters and some ground support, and were really, really nice guys. But we had meetings and we were trying to see if we could reoccupy our old embassy and our old ambassador's residence and recrank things there. And it would start out as a US liaison office, not an embassy full blown yet. So we had to meet with the members of the Vietnamese government. And after a while, we had to put ourselves up in a hotel. Well, these people were, let's say, not happy we were there. It was, strangely enough, we had meetings supposedly with our contemporaries in the Vietnamese government. several of these meetings were canceled. The hotel we stayed in, suddenly they had put us on the fourth or fifth floors, and suddenly the elevators were broken, didn't work. So we had a little trouble getting up and down. To make a long story short, it was not a real happy time. They took us one day to the memorial mausoleum for Ho Chi Minh, and I refused to go in, and that made them quite unhappy with me. But there was nothing harmful about it as far as my body was concerned. But that was the first trip in, and then we left Hanoi knowing that we would have to find a location for a new embassy, but first of all, a temporary spot for a liaison office, and we left with several possible sites to look at in more detail. And we flew then down country to Saigon, and went to the old American embassy in Saigon. That was an eerie visit because it had been kept by the Vietnamese open and running, but only the first floor had been occupied, but I think that was occupied by the South Vietnamese Fisheries Department. But we went into the old embassy, went all the way up to the top floor, out on the roof, and the roof still had the sandbag emplacements where the Marines had been on the roof. And it was an eerie situation. It really was. To make a long story short, after several trips in and out of Vietnam, we were able to establish in Hanoi a liaison office. And the first guy there that ran it was a guy named Pete Peterson, who had been, I understand, a prisoner of war in the same location. So that was an interesting twist to things. Down in Saigon, we eventually took down the old embassy right to the ground. But we built a new consulate in the same location and decked it out with a few more trinkets that would make it less vulnerable than the old embassy used to be. And eventually, after I left that area, we're now up and running full blown. But going around Saigon, which I had visited several times during the war, to seeing old locations and places where we knew things had not gone well was a real experience that it made us only remember things and guys that had given their lives to try to protect what we knew was possibly their only chance to do things right. You know, early on in my tours, I determined that yeah, we're out here to win a war, to kill the bad guys. But I became more and more convinced that it was equally important, if not more important, to save the good guys. And that was part of our job. So I went all over that area in my State Department years. I was in Laos, I was in Cambodia, Thailand, uh, Myanmar, and all the embassies and consulates that are in those locations. Uh, I had a very interesting experience in Cambodia because when I was on my first tour and I went to Hong Kong to meet my wife, like I said earlier in this discussion, on R&R, we were on an air flight out of our Air Vietnam flight, charter flight. That was how the R&R guys got out to Hong Kong from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. And I got on my flight to go to Hong Kong, and I noticed there was only one other guy with me who was a GI, because we had to fly in khakis in uniform when we went on R&R. And being a pilot in and out of Tan Son Nhut by helicopter once in a while, the flight took off, and instead of going up to full orbit to get out of everybody's fire and then head to Hong Kong, it went up to about only, I estimated maybe 10,000 feet, and kept flying to the west, almost due west. I thought, gee, this is strange. So not only that, but about 25 minutes later, we started to let down and we landed in Phnom Penh. Well, Cambodia was off limits in those days. One of my first tour was there. And I looked at this guy who was sitting 2 seats over from me, and we're kind of wondering what the heck's going on here. Plane comes to a halt, the doors open, several people got off, and then somebody got on. And the guys that got on were Cambodian soldiers, and they had AKs, and they escorted this other guy and I off the aircraft over towards this old beat up terminal. Well, this guy and I saw a neon sign and hanging in one of the windows. We figured, oh, gee, that's the bar. So we'll just go over there and hang out till all this dust settles and we can get back and start again. No, no, no. They took us in another door, down a hallway, and stopped in front of a double door, opened it, took us in, and we were in this room with a movie screen and maybe 20 or 30 seats. And we were escorted to a seat and shoved down. The lights went out and cameras came on, and a black and white film started playing, a propaganda film with American written subtitles about how the Chinese were helping their brothers in Cambodia with everything, medical and farming and doing all these wonderful things. So the lights came back on, film was over, guys came back, escorted us back out, across the tarmac, up the stairs, back in the aircraft. We took off for Hong Kong. Now I knew this was haywire. So when I got back from R&R to Tan Son Nhut, and my boys picked me up and took me back to Benoit, I thought, gee, I got to tell somebody about what the heck's going on here. So I went to the Air Force intelligence guys at Benoit Air Base and told them my story. Then I didn't think much about it. About 3 months later, I'm out in a fire support base with a little PSP, pure steel plank runway. And this C-130 lands, and an Air Force guy gets off, and after a while, somebody's saying, there's this guy in the Air Force looking for Kuhblank. And I said, okay, fine. So we got lashed up. He says, they sent me out here just to tell you that the end of the story of your story is they pulled the plug on these guys one day and they hauled off about 10 or 12 uh, plants, Vietnamese spies that were hanging out in Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon and were being shuttled back and forth between there and Phnom Penh, where their base was. And as it turned out, the guy who booked R&R flights, who was an operative, was sick one day, and his replacement didn't know anything about that. So he made the mistake of booking 2 Americans on one of the flights to Phnom Penh that was an R&R flight. And that's how they managed to pull the plug on these things. So that was an interesting story.
Wow. So I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. So they sent you there by mistake, and the guys who received you assumed that you belonged there and showed you the requisite,
Well,
propaganda.
they knew that we shouldn't have been there, but they took the opportunity to show us the propaganda at the same time. The very bottom line of all this, if I can finish it up, is back when I went to the State Department and I went into Cambodia and Phnom Penh to set up a liaison office there too. The first trip we landed, which was quite all right this time, but they were tearing down that old terminal. Part of it was still up and they were under construction in a pretty modern new air terminal. But we had to go to the baggage area in the old part. And when we did, I walked down the same hallway, past the same 2 doors where I'd been escorted to the movie as before, and it was about to be torn down. Eerie feeling.
Yeah, that is amazing. Um, well, I've already taken up more of your time now than I asked for. But if you'll indulge me, can you go another 10 minutes?
Why not?
Great. So, can we talk a little bit now just about? Well, do you remember the first time that you visited the wall in DC?
Uh, yeah, I think so. I I was still on active duty at that time, and I was the wall was I think commissioned in '82, and at that time I was assigned to NATO headquarters in Mons, Belgium, and I didn't get back until '83, late '83, I guess. But I remember the first time that Lena and I, because we went together, if I remember right, went down to see the wall. And at first I was looking all around the mall and I couldn't find it. Well, if you come in from the wrong direction, you can't see anything. And then suddenly we were down on the side where you could see the wall and the cut in the ground. And it was surrounded. I mean, there was lots and lots of people there that particular day. It was a nice day, but I I had lost several guys, and I found them myself on the wall through the big index that they had, you know, that lists the panel and the line where you can find your name of the guy you have. And it was kind of a closure thing because it had been a number of years for me in other places. But then I started to notice the other people, and there were so many people there that were leaving memos and making you know, holding up things and sketching the names in pencil. And there was quite a number of people who lost it. It was a very tender thing for people. I think it was closure for a lot of families. It was a marvelous creation, so simple and yet so deep. So we ended up being assigned to Fort Belvoir, just south of DC in Virginia. And so we often had visitors, and I would always take them to the wall, especially if they were military people that we knew that had never been there. I think it was powerful. I know that when the first time I went, the first statue was already up with the soldiers and the flag. And that's powerful too. And then along came the nurses a little later. Really, really amazing. And I understand that I don't know the facts, but you would, that there's going to be an underground museum of some kind too, if it all turns out right. Maybe you can verify that with me. But regardless, I think it was so important for the traveling wall to get started. The wall that heals, the 3/4 size, 140 panel rendition of the one in DC, because I live in Delaware. Delaware's only 2.5, 3 hours from the mall, right from where I am. But you would have been amazed the number of people that for the very first time got to do that kind of closure and get those kinds of memories back in Delaware when the wall came here. And so I think that sending things on the road, people aren't as mobile as you think they are sometimes. And they just never get around to doing things like making a visitation to Washington, D.C., which is a beautiful place. Of all the capitals I've been to in the world, why, it's right up there at the top. And I always took my visitors down to see the wall and the other memorials too, by the way, on Sundays, because Sunday is a low traffic day in Washington, D.C., and you could actually get around to several places with some ease. So anyway, I I still think it's important that those memories of guys that are getting old now still have great meaning to families and grandkids and others who are still kicking.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with that, which is one of the reasons why we're starting this podcast, right? We feel like we need to get these stories recorded and, for posterity. So I appreciate you sharing your time and your energy with us today. And just talking for a second about the wall that heals. It's been off the road since the pandemic started. Um, it just didn't make any sense to try and have large gatherings, anywhere. So we're looking forward to getting that back on the road as soon as possible. One of the things that travels with that replica is the mobile education center, and inside the mobile education center, one of the exhibits is a flight helmet that you donated. Um, do you remember the circumstances that led you to make that donation?
Um, yeah, I do. The wall was here in Ocean View at the VFW site. Um, and I enjoyed the displays that it had in the educational vehicle. Uh, and at the 50 years anniversary, which was a ways before the wall visited, we had done a couple of displays in our post, and among other things, I had taken in my old flight helmet then and a bunch of pictures, and other guys had contributed little mementos of this, that, and the other thing. Well, when the wall that heals came, we dug that stuff back out and put it up for display too. Well, uh, Heidi and Tim, who you know, uh, we showed them around the VFW at the time they were there too, and I guess that they spotted the helmet and thought, gee, we were thinking of making a new display with a little more emphasis on helicopters and what they contributed to the war. And so Heidi asked me, she says, Rick, she says, what do you think? Do you think you'd be willing to let us display your helmet? And I said, gosh, yes, take it. I mean, it was a no-brainer because it had been gathering dust in the closet, and to have it out on display instead of closeted was just a great idea to me. And not only that, but it keeps a piece of me moving around the country when I don't any longer move around the country like that, especially with such a great bunch of people and so many memories going right along with it. So I coughed it up with humble gratitude. It's a real treat to an honor to be part of that new display.
Thank you again for just being willing to spend this amount of time talking to me.
Whatever happens, I hope it's a little more enlightening for people and they come to grips with uh, how it is that things get away in the world, but I still up the pieces.